When we study the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., one cannot overlook the vital question, who benefited the most from his death? This is not merely an emotional or sectarian question. It is a question of political logic, of historical cause and effect, of who had the motive, the means, and the mindset to eliminate the beloved grandson of the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him. In the words of Dr. Zakir Naik, whenever you want to understand who was behind a crime, ask yourself, who stands to gain? In the case of Imam Hasan A.S., the answer becomes increasingly evident the more one analyzes the facts carefully and impartially. After the martyrdom of his father, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib A.S., Imam Hasan A.S. became the rightful leader of the Muslim Ummah. However, due to the political unrest and internal strife, he entered into a peace treaty with Muawiya ibn Abi Sufyan, leader of the opposing camp. The treaty was not a surrender. It was a strategic move to preserve the blood of Muslims and prevent civil war. Imam Hasan A.S. agreed to relinquish political control on the condition that Muawiya would rule by the Quran and Sunnah, and that leadership would return to Imam Hasan A.S. after Muawiya's death. Furthermore, the treaty explicitly stated that Muawiya had no right to appoint a successor. This clause is absolutely critical. It meant that the Umayyad dynasty could not continue through heredity, and therefore Yazid, Muawiya's son, had no legitimate path to power as long as Imam Hasan A.S. was alive. Now, let's use basic reasoning. As long as Imam Hasan A.S. lived, Yazid could never be appointed as the next caliph. So who would logically want Imam Hasan A.S. removed from the scene, who had the political ambition to establish a dynasty through his son? Who had the resources, the network, and the ruthlessness to carry out such a plan while keeping their hands apparently clean? The answer points squarely toward Muawiya. Multiple Sunni and Shia sources, such as al-Masyudi's Miraj al-Dahab and Ibn Kathir's al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, either directly or indirectly indicate Muawiya's involvement in the events leading to Imam Hasan's poisoning. The method of assassination also supports this theory. Imam Hasan A.S. was reportedly poisoned by his wife, Jada bint al-Ashath, but according to historical narrations, she was not acting alone. She was allegedly bribed with the promise of marriage to Yazid and a large sum of money if she successfully poisoned her husband. Now ask yourself, would a woman in that time, especially a woman from a political family, risk poisoning the grandson of the Prophet without the backing or instruction of someone powerful? Would she take such a step without guaranteed protection or reward? The circumstantial evidence overwhelmingly suggests that she was a pawn in a larger political game, a tool in the hands of those who wanted to eliminate Imam Hasan A.S. silently without creating a wave of public outrage. It is also important to note that Muawiya, throughout his rule, systematically removed or silenced those who posed a threat to his power or narrative. He altered Islamic practices, enforced state propaganda, and used wealth and fear to manipulate tribal leaders and companions. Eliminating Imam Hasan A.S. was not just about one man. It was about removing the biggest obstacle to establishing the hereditary monarchy of Yazid. Once Imam Hasan A.S. was martyred, the path was clear for Muawiya to declare his son as successor, a move that directly violated the treaty and laid the foundation for the tragedy of Karbala. In conclusion, when we look at the death of Imam Hasan A.S., not just emotionally but logically, asking who benefited the most and who had the means to carry out such an act, the historical pieces begin to fall into place. The evidence, both direct and indirect, points clearly toward the political ambition of Muawiya, making him the most probable architect behind the poisoning and martyrdom of the beloved grandson of the Prophet, peace be upon him. When we examine the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A. S. It is important to recognize that it was not the result of a single event or one isolated act of betrayal. Rather, it was part of a repeated effort, a consistent pattern of attempts on his life through poison. According to multiple historical accounts, Imam Hasan A.S. was poisoned not once, but at least 3 times, and 2 of these attempts were unsuccessful before the final, fatal dose. This isn't simply a myth or a Shia narration. Many Sunni historians, such as Ibn Sa'd, al-Dinawari, and al-Masyudi, have documented these earlier poisoning attempts in their works. So the question arises, why were there repeated attempts to kill Imam Hasan A.S.? What made him such a constant target of assassination, and who would have both the motivation and the access to carry out such attacks? After the peace treaty between Imam Hasan A.S. and Muawiya was signed, many people assumed that the political struggle had ended, but the reality is quite different. While Imam Hasan A.S. stepped back from open conflict to preserve the unity of the Ummah, his very existence remained a threat to the power structure that Muawiya was trying to build. Imam Hasan A.S. was not only the grandson of the Prophet Piba, he was also the rightful heir to leadership in the eyes of many Muslims. As long as he was alive, Muawiya's position remained weak and uncertain. People still looked toward Hassan ibn Ali A.S. as the legitimate guide of the Ummah. In fact, many believed that Muawiya's rule was temporary and leadership would return to Imam Hasan A.S. after his death, as the treaty had promised. This created deep insecurity in the political corridors of Damascus. Now, logically speaking, when someone attempts to assassinate a political figure multiple times using poison, method that requires close access and secrecy, it implies not a random act, but a planned campaign executed by someone with both intent and influence. The earlier failed attempts prove that someone was persistent. And since Imam Hasan A.S. had withdrawn from power and was no longer threatening anyone militarily, these attempts were not acts of revenge but of prevention of his continued influence, and more importantly, prevention of the implementation of the treaty's terms, which stated that leadership would return to him or someone he appoints after Muawiya. The timing of the poisonings also aligns with periods of political tension. When Muawiya began his efforts to ensure that his son Yazid would succeed him, a move that violated the treaty, Imam Hasan A.S. presence became a major obstacle, because if Imam Hasan A.S. was alive when Muawiya died, the Muslim community would reject Yazid in favor of the Prophet's grandson. Therefore, eliminating Imam Hasan A.S. was not a personal vendetta. It was a political necessity for those determined to turn the caliphate into a monarchy. Now ask, who had the authority, the reach, and the most to gain by removing Imam Hasan A.S. quietly? Who would go to the lengths of using intermediaries, possibly even bribing someone close to him in order to achieve this goal? Only someone who saw Imam Hasan A.S. not just as a religious figure, but as a threat to political ambition, would repeatedly attempt to kill him, not with the sword, which would provoke public backlash, but with poison, which would allow denial and control of the narrative. So when we reflect on these repeated poisonings, they serve as undeniable proof of a calculated strategy to erase the opposition silently. They reveal the desperation of power structures that could not coexist with the presence of someone as spiritually and politically legitimate as Imam Hasan A.S. And they expose the truth that the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S. was not accidental, but a carefully executed step in the consolidation of power that would eventually lead to the tragedy of Karbala. When we speak about the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., one of the most crucial principles to apply is the simple but powerful question, who benefited the most from his death? This question, based on logical deduction and political insight, helps uncover the truth behind many historical events. As Dr. Zakir Naik often says, when you examine any case, whether religious or political, you must always follow the logic of benefit and motive. If we apply this principle here, the picture becomes increasingly clear. The only figure who stood to gain from the elimination of Imam Hasan A.S. was Muawiya ibn Abi Sufyan, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty and the ruling caliph at the time. Let us look at the situation in its historical context. Imam Hasan A.S. had signed a peace treaty with Muawiya, not because he approved of Muawiya's actions, but because he wanted to preserve the blood of Muslims and prevent further civil war. The treaty, however, was conditional. It stated that Muawiya could rule only for his lifetime and was not permitted to appoint a successor, and that leadership would return to Imam Hasan A.S. or be decided by consultation. This treaty was not just a paper agreement. It was a public and moral contract, one that Muslims across the region were aware of. It meant that any move to declare Yazid, the son of Muawiya, as the next caliph while Imam Hasan A.S. was still alive would be viewed as a clear breach of the treaty and a challenge to Islamic principles of leadership. Muawiya understood this very well. He knew that while Imam Hasan A.S. remained alive, the Muslim Ummah would never fully accept Yazid. Imam Hasan A.S. was the grandson of the Prophet P.B., the son of Fatima A.S. and Ali A.S., and a man known for his knowledge, piety, and leadership. In contrast, Yazid was already known for his un-Islamic lifestyle and lack of moral and spiritual credibility. Therefore, Muawiya had only two options: either abandon his plan to make Yazid the next ruler, or eliminate the one man who could oppose it with legitimacy and public support. Now consider the method of the martyrdom: poison, a silent, invisible, and deniable weapon. It allowed those behind the plan to hide their involvement while removing their most significant obstacle. And according to various historical sources, Muawiya orchestrated the final poisoning of Imam Hasan A.S. by influencing someone within his own household, his wife, Jada bint al-Ash'ath. She was reportedly promised wealth and marriage to Yazid in return for administering the poison. But when she fulfilled the act, Muawiya gave her the wealth but never allowed her to marry Yazid. Why? Because he didn't trust someone who had betrayed her own husband. This account is documented not just in Shia books, but also in works by Sunni scholars such as Ibn Saud and al-Baladhuri. Again, let us apply logical reasoning: who had the motive to bypass the terms of the peace treaty, who had the resources to offer bribes and influence individuals close to Imam Hasan A.S., who stood to benefit the most by silencing the one person who could legally and morally challenge the nomination of Yazid. Every arrow of logic points toward Muawiya, and history confirms that not long after the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., Muawiya openly declared Yazid as his successor, violating the very treaty that had brought him to power. Therefore, the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S. was not just an act of personal betrayal. It was a calculated political move designed to clear the path for a corrupt monarchy. His death symbolized the end of prophetic leadership and the rise of dynastic rule that led to tragedies like Karbala. When we reflect on the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., one disturbing but important detail stands out. The person who physically administered the poison was none other than his wife, Jada bint al-Ash'ath. This fact is reported by both Sunni and Shia historians, including al-Baladhuri, Ibn Saud, and Ibn Abi al-Haddad. But what must be understood clearly and with deep insight is that this woman did not act out of personal hatred or a private quarrel. No, she was used as a political tool, a mere pawn in a much larger game, and that game was being played by those who feared the moral authority and political legitimacy of Imam Hasan A. especially Muawiya, who had everything to lose if Imam Hasan remained alive. Let's analyze this carefully. Jada was from a politically known family. Her father, Al-Ash'ath ibn Qays, was himself a controversial figure, known for his shifting allegiances during the early Islamic period. She was married to the grandson of the Prophet Piba, yet she allowed herself to be influenced, some say bribed, with promises of wealth and royal marriage. According to narrations, Muawiya offered her a large sum of money and the promise that she would marry his son Yazid if she carried out the assassination. This reveals not just her role, but who stood behind her and who engineered the entire plot. Now someone may ask, why would Muawiya use Imam Hasan's wife instead of directly sending a killer? The answer is very simple. Poisoning someone from within their own household is the most discreet and least suspicious method. It avoids public scandal, eliminates blame, and allows full control of the narrative. If Imam Hasan A.S. had been killed by an external enemy or soldier, it would have caused an uproar among Muslims. But by using his wife, those responsible made the crime look like a domestic tragedy, not a political assassination. This kind of planning requires more than just hatred. It requires strategy, access, and political motive. But here lies the deeper injustice. Jada didn't act alone. She was manipulated by people who knew how to exploit greed and ambition. And after the deed was done, when she approached Muawiya to claim her promised marriage to Yazid, he turned her away. Reports say that Muawiya gave her the wealth, but then said, "Do you think I would marry my son to a woman who poisoned her own husband?" This cold response confirms that she was never respected, only used. And it also highlights the true moral bankruptcy of those behind the plan. They not only orchestrated the murder of a man who was the grandson of the Prophet, but they also discarded the tool they used once she was no longer useful. This event also reveals something even more tragic: how far power-hungry rulers were willing to go to achieve their goals. To bribe a wife to poison her husband, to kill the very grandson of the messenger of Allah, not with a sword on the battlefield, but with poison in his own home. That is not just a crime of murder, it is a crime against the very spirit of Islam. Imam Hasan A.S. represented truth, peace, and prophetic legacy. He had given up his rightful claim to avoid bloodshed, yet even his sacrifice was not enough for those who wanted absolute control. Therefore, when we talk about the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., we must not only mention Jada's betrayal, but understand who was truly behind it, who provided the motive, and who benefited. And that answer consistently leads back to the one who had the most to gain by clearing the path for Yazid, and the least respect for justice in the process. As we explore the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., one cannot ignore the depth of betrayal he faced not just from political enemies, but from those who were supposed to be part of his own camp. One of the most heartbreaking realities is that the betrayal came from within, from individuals who outwardly professed loyalty, yet secretly worked against him. These betrayals were not limited to just one event or one person, but were part of a larger pattern of hypocrisy and double dealing that eventually led to his poisoning and death. In understanding this, we see that the physical act of poisoning was only the final blow in a long series of internal treacheries. After the peace treaty with Muawiya, Imam Hasan A.S. chose to live a quieter life in Medina, away from direct political activity. But even there, the seeds of betrayal had already been sown. Many companions and tribal leaders who had previously pledged allegiance to him turned away when their personal interests were threatened. Some accepted bribes from Muawiya, others were promised positions of power in exchange for silence. There are historical accounts, such as those found in Al-Tabari and Ibn Abi al-Hadid, that confirm how even within the circle of Imam Hasan A, S. Spies and informants had been planted. His movements were being reported to Damascus, and his closest relationships were being used against him. It's important to remember that betrayal doesn't always come with a sword or poison in hand. Sometimes, betrayal comes in the form of silence, of knowing the truth and choosing not to speak. Many individuals, aware of the brewing conspiracy against Imam Hasan A.S., chose to stay quiet out of fear or self-interest. Their inaction allowed the plan to progress, and their silence gave strength to those plotting his death. Even his wife Jada's act of poisoning, as devastating as it was, didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in an environment where people had become numb to truth and loyal only to wealth and power. This pattern of betrayal wasn't new for the Ahlul Bayt A.S. It was a continuation of what had been happening since the death of the Prophet Muhammad P.B. Imam Ali A.S. had faced similar betrayal during his caliphate, and Imam Hasan A.S. inherited not just his father's position, but also the same enemies and disloyalties. When he signed the treaty, many saw it as weakness, when in reality, it was a demonstration of wisdom and mercy. But that decision gave his enemies the time and space to dig deeper into his circle and influence those closest to him. Let us reflect for a moment. If someone as pure, as beloved, and as closely related to the Prophet P.B. as Imam Hasan A.S. could be betrayed by his own people, what does that tell us about the nature of political power at that time? It tells us that corruption had already reached deep into the fabric of society, that truth and justice were no longer guiding principles, but obstacles in the way of those who sought to build dynasties. And to remove those obstacles, they did not hesitate to use money, manipulation, and even poison. Imam Hasan A.S. was not killed only by the hand of one person. He was martyred by the betrayal of a system that had lost its moral compass. The people who stood to protect him, who had once raised the slogan of his leadership, slowly turned away one by one, allowing the final crime to occur without resistance. That is perhaps the greatest tragedy, not just that he was poisoned, but that his poisoning was made possible by betrayal from within. After the martyrdom of Imam Hasan A.S., the way his body was treated reveals a final, bitter truth about the political and spiritual climate of that time. This wasn't just about poisoning a man in secrecy. What followed after his death showed the depth of enmity that still burned in the hearts of those in power. When his funeral procession began and the body of the beloved grandson of the Prophet P.B. was being carried, the people accompanying him wished to bury him next to his grandfather in Masjid al-Nabawi, as was his right. But even in death, that right was denied. According to historical records mentioned in both Sunni and Shia sources, including Ibn Sa'd, al-Yaqubi, and al-Masyudi, it was Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the widow of the Prophet P.B., who led the objection against Imam Hasan A.S. being buried near the Prophet. She claimed that the house was her personal property, even though it had become a burial site for the Prophet P.B., Abu Bakr, and Umar. But logically, if the Prophet's family had any right over that place, it was Fatima's children, not others. And yet, Aisha ordered people to gather with weapons and threaten the funeral procession. Arrows were fired at the body of Imam Hasan A.S. Arrows at the Janazah of the grandson of the Messenger of Allah. And this is recorded in multiple reliable texts. Now think for a moment, what kind of environment allows such disrespect to go unchecked? What type of leadership turns a blind eye when the Prophet's own bloodline is dishonored in this way? The answer is a system that had become so politically motivated, so detached from Islamic values, that even the sanctity of death and the final rites were not protected. Muawiya did not stop this aggression. In fact, it aligned with his goals. The refusal to allow Imam Hasan A.S. To be buried beside his grandfather was not a matter of legal dispute. It was a clear political message that the Ahlul Bayt had no space even in death in the center of Islamic authority. The plan was not only to remove Imam Hasan A.S. from the political scene through poisoning, but also to remove him from the hearts of the people. Denying him burial next to the Prophet was meant to erase that symbolic connection, to distance him from the legacy of leadership and prophethood. And yet, in trying to do so, those responsible only exposed their own fear and insecurity. They knew very well that if Imam Hasan A.S. was buried next to the Prophet, the public would always remember who he was: the rightful heir, the patient peacemaker, and the oppressed one. In contrast to this rejection, the followers of Ahlul Bayt showed restraint and wisdom. Imam Husain A.S. chose not to escalate the conflict. He decided to bury his brother in Janazah al-Baqi, just a few steps away, to avoid bloodshed and further dishonor. But this moment, this act of shooting arrows at a funeral, remains a stain on the pages of Islamic history. It is proof that the enemies of truth did not stop at political assassination. They wanted to strip the Ahlul Bayt of dignity, legacy, and spiritual connection to the Prophet himself. And yet, despite all of this, Imam Hasan A.S. remains honored, remembered, and revered by millions around the world. His enemies, despite their efforts, failed to bury his legacy. Because no matter how many arrows they shoot, or how many lies they spread, the truth of his sacrifice continues to shine through history.